Liberal leader Mark Carney has promised a quick and seamless transition, but isn't saying when that might be.
Just had a long meeting with the Prime Minister. We discussed the most important issues for our country, obviously including Canada and U.S. relations, issues of national security, and, yes, the transition between the Prime Minister and myself. That transition will be seamless and it will be quick. Finally, I, as you may have heard, just had a meeting with the caucus. There is tremendous energy in the Liberal caucus. As you saw last evening, this is a united party with full of energy to serve Canadians.
Carney won his party's leadership Sunday by a landslide and had a long private meeting with the Prime Minister Monday on Parliament Hill. The two discussed Carney taking the reins from Justin Trudeau, as well as national security and Canada-U.S. relations. An election call is expected soon after Carney becomes Prime Minister, but the timeline is foggy even among Liberal MPs. Joining me now is Liberal strategist Andrew Perez for more on what happens next. Andrew, thank you for joining me today.
Great to be here.
So I want to start with Carney's win. He did win by a landslide. Were you surprised by the results?
Look, I was not surprised by the ultimate result. I was somewhat surprised by the margin. Mr. Carney prevailed on Sunday evening, and by the way, I was in the convention hall in Ottawa, garnering 86% of the points in this leadership race. It was a stunning victory. Miss Freeland runner-up with only 8%, and Miss Gould and Mr. Bayless coming in at a paltry 3%. So he really did mop the floor. And what it suggests, Theresa, is that the Liberal Party of Canada, in spite of the challenges that it's faced over the past 18 months, is incredibly united at this critical time for the country and the party. Mr. Carney is Prime Minister designate. I expect him to be officially sworn into office by the end of the week alongside a revamped cabinet. And it's looking like the country will be plunged into a general federal election within days. I'm hearing that an election call could come as soon as Sunday, March 23rd, with election day taking place on April 28th or May 5th.
Now, I want to talk about the margin between Carney and Freeland. Some are pointing out that Chrystia Freeland had an underwhelming performance given the position that she held in the Trudeau government. What do you make of her getting such a small fraction of that final vote?
Yeah, there's no doubt that this was very disappointing for Miss Freeland and her campaign team. I think Carney was the early frontrunner in this very short 7-week leadership race, but it became evident to me within days of the leadership campaign starting back in mid-January that this was Mr. Carney's to lose. When you look at the fundraising, Mr. Carney brought in, $4.5 million during this short leadership race, whereas Miss Freeland and Miss Gould only brought in $360,000 each. And so I think as the weeks went on and as we rapidly approached the announcement that took place on Sunday, it became clear that Mr. Carney was going to win by a very large margin. I think that Miss Freeland was inhibited by her close affiliation with the Trudeau government over the past decade, and although she is ultimately the one who spurred Mr. Trudeau's resignation in early January by her bombshell resignation in mid-December, she was not rewarded for that resignation and for what she did, and I find that very interesting.
Now, during the leadership race, Freeland committed to having Mark Carney in her cabinet if she won. Do you think that Mark Carney will add Freeland to his?
It's a good question. Mr. Carney will have to unveil a new cabinet within days, and he's walking a tightrope between maintaining cabinet veterans like Finance Minister Dominique LeBlanc, Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly, and also newly minted Public Safety Minister David McGuinty. He'll want to keep those senior cabinet ministers who are navigating the U.S.-Canada file among this trade war, while also bringing in some new blood. I do expect this cabinet, Theresa, to be a lot smaller. The current Trudeau cabinet boasts nearly 40 members. I think Carney's cabinet will be much smaller, perhaps 25 or even as low as 20 members. In terms of where Freeland will go, it's a good question. I don't think she's going to be appointed as finance or deputy prime minister. I do note that international trade minister Mary Ng is not running again, and so perhaps there might be a spot for Miss Freeland at international trade. That's a post that she held 10 years ago.
And is there a reason you feel like Carney might have a smaller cabinet?
I think it's in line with his focus
Mhm.
on building a more efficient government, spending less but providing more value. I firmly believe there's no reason why the federal cabinet needs to be so large.
Mhm.
We've seen in recent years and recent decades, the federal cabinet gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I do think Mr. Carney will take a back to basics approach and trim the size of this cabinet considerably. And that will make his decisions tougher because he won't be able to include as many people as part of his executive.
Well, Carney did announce that Marco Mendicino will serve as his chief of staff, at least during the transition. Does that help or hurt Carney moving forward?
I think it's a smart move. I think Marco Mendicino is a veteran Liberal MP. He served in senior cabinet roles as immigration minister and minister of public safety. He is a very political individual who has held his Eglinton Lawrence riding for the past decade, winning it by increasing margins every election. And so I think Mr. Carney will be looking to Marco Mendicino as a political veteran in this interim period. He's only serving in the lead up to an election that will probably be called within 2 weeks. So I think Mr. Mendicino will play a critical role ensuring that the cabinet is appointed, the platform is ready, the campaign is ready to go, and really serving as the chief operating officer of this government at a time when it's dealing on a daily basis with the Trump administration.
Now, towards the end of Trudeau's run as prime minister, he really started to gain more traction with Canadians for the way that he handled the Trump tariff threats. Do you think that the Liberal Party is going to miss Trudeau, or now that the dust has kind of settled, the party's exactly where it needs to be in order to move forward?
I think the party is in a good position.
Mhm.
And while I think that Mr. Trudeau did need to go and that his resignation a few weeks ago was welcome, it's true that Mr. Trudeau is leaving on a high note. He truly has demonstrated leadership in several of his speeches and in implementing dollar for dollar retaliatory tariffs. Many have said that Trudeau has divided the nation in recent years. I would argue that in the final 6 to 7 weeks of his prime ministership, he has actually brought the country together in a Team Canada approach, united the people, united premiers, standing strong for Canada, its economic interests, and fighting for Canadian sovereignty in this very precarious time for our country.
And you did touch on the fact that a federal election might be called rather soon. But politicians like Elizabeth May and Jagmeet Singh have kind of spoken out and said that maybe hold off with the election while we deal with Donald Trump's tariffs. And then once that's kind of figured out, we'll go from there. Is there a reason that you think that an election is going to be called immediately? Or do you think it's a better idea to have Parliament kind of chill, figure out what to do moving forward, and then have an election in a little bit?
I think the train has left the station when it
Mm.
comes to election speculation. I think Mr. Carney wants to capitalize on the popularity that we're seeing across the country. Liberal Party polling is rebounding. 6 weeks ago, the party was 20 to 25 points behind the Conservatives. Today, the Liberal and Conservative parties are in a dead heat. It's
Mhm.
also important to note that Mr. Carney does not hold a seat. And so, if he were to bring back Parliament on March 24th, when the prorogation is scheduled to end, he
Mhm.
would not actually be able to sit in the House of Commons and speak. And it's unclear whether the opposition parties would actually support this government. It's not clear to me that Mr. Carney would be able to command the confidence of the House of Commons. And so for those three reasons, I think that we are headed into an election within the next 2 weeks.
Now, the Conservatives have spent a lot of time criticizing Carney for not disclosing his financial interests. Now that he's the leader, when should we expect to see that process carry through?
Well, in fact, earlier today, Theresa, Mr. Carney was very proactive. He submitted a comprehensive conflict of interest plan to the Federal Ethics Commissioner. And as part of that submission, he is divesting all of his controlled assets, not including personal real estate, and putting them into a blind trust. Federal law stipulates that any prime minister, cabinet minister, or even parliamentary secretary serving in Ottawa must put their controlled interest into a blind trust within 4 months or 90 days, or 120 days rather, of taking office. And Mr. Carney has proactively done so 4 months early, before even being formally sworn into the Prime Minister's office. And so I think he's taken a really proactive approach in doing this today. And I think it demonstrates that his ethics are beyond reproach, and the Conservatives are simply playing partisan politics.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Theresa. Take care.